Well, good morning to everyone joining us from North America. Good afternoon to those of you who are in Europe, and welcome to all of you wherever you are located on this planet. I'm Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and very glad to have you with us today for something that has become a bit of a tradition for us, and especially for our program of the AICGS DAAD fellowships. We are partnered with the German Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst, which helps us sponsor these fellowships. And at the end of each of our visiting scholars' research periods, they present their findings, usually over a lunch in our offices in Washington, D.C., and we invite scholars, government officials, and members of the public. Well, for obvious reasons, we have been conducting our fellowships virtually this year through an agreement with the DAAD. And we are very pleased to host 3 visiting fellows virtually this fall at our institute. Now, we've been doing all of our activities online since March, as probably most of you watching have been doing as well. But this is our first virtual DAAD seminar, so we're glad to have you with us for that. And let me give you just a few notes about how today's session will run. We will use the Q&A function in Zoom, which you're probably familiar with, but it's at the bottom of your screen. Please use that if you would like to ask a question or comment on the presentation. I will be moderating the Q&A when we get to that stage. So if you can please make your questions and comments as concise and focused as possible, I think that will help us incorporate as many of them as possible into today's session. Now, despite the difficulties that come with having virtual fellowships, the silver lining is that we can reach a broader audience online than we can fit into our conference room at 1776 Massachusetts Avenue. And so I'm very glad that we've got dozens of people joining us today. And our speaker today is Maximilian Ernst. He has been a research fellow here throughout the fall. He is a researcher and PhD candidate in political science at the Institute for European Studies of the Free University of Brussels. His PhD research focuses on Chinese coercive diplomacy. And prior to his doctoral studies, Maximilian worked as a consultant for the Korea Trade Investment Promotion Agency in Hamburg, and he has an MA in international security from Yonsei University in Seoul, and a BA in Chinese studies from the University of Mainz. So someone who is deeply knowledgeable about dynamics in East Asia, and we're very glad to have him here to present on the question of how to respond to China's carrots and sticks, prospects of a transatlantic response to Chinese economic coercion. So with that, I think we should get started. Maximilian, the floor is yours. He will make a presentation of about 25 minutes. And then after that, we will switch to Q&A and discussion. So thank you all for being with us. And I will now turn the floor over to Maximilian.
Yes, thank you, Jeff, for the very kind introduction. And also, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the AICGS for the opportunity to conduct this research over the past weeks. What I will do today is I will first, so to say, talk shop for about 10 minutes and introduce my own research from my PhD project on Chinese coercion in the Asian regional, Asia-Pacific regional context, and then transit over to the European theater, and also provide some observations of Chinese coercion in Europe. And this will then provide the basis for some policy recommendations or ideas that I will formulate. And then towards the end, I'm looking forward to your feedback and questions and towards the end of my presentation. So without further ado, I will get right and start with my presentation. I will commence with this picture of Chinese Minister of Foreign Trade and Economic Cooperation signing the WTO accession protocol in 2001. This, so to say, provides the backdrop of the puzzle that I want to introduce to you first. So over the past 3 decades, outside observers expected China to integrate into the global economy. The liberal paradigm was that increased interdependence makes conflict forbiddingly costly. And China watchers believed that China would have little to gain and much to lose from fundamentally challenging the status quo. After all, there were very successful cases in Europe where economic cooperation led to more political stability in form of the European Union, and also in Southeast Asia with ASEAN, there was a similar successful project on the way. I provide you here with 2 pictures, one of Admiral Zheng He, and on the right side of Li Keqiang with leaders of Southeast Asia. And the point that I want to drive home here is that it is really in China's core national interest to maintain friendly relations with its neighbors. And that's why they use this Zheng He as a symbol, so to say. He's something like the Chinese Columbus. He was an admiral during the Ming Dynasty, and he had a huge fleet, and he sailed to Southeast Asia, to South Asia, and even to the East African coast. And the point that China emphasizes always is, different to the Europeans, the Chinese didn't colonize; they only traded, and that's all they want. So this is, you know, whether this is historically accurate or not, or whether you can translate this into the future, what this means is beside the point here. But what this shows is, Beijing emphasizing Zheng He, is that Beijing is really aware of the necessity to maintain stable and friendly relations with its neighbors, and that Beijing goes to great lengths to assure its neighbors that it's rising peacefully and does not seek to dominate the Asian Pacific region or even beyond that. So against this Chinese interest of maintaining stable relations with the neighborhood and even with the entire world, economic coercion seems puzzling. It's in fact in very stark contrast to what we would perceive China's interest to be. And economic coercion is a stark and direct break with the liberal paradigm, because it leverages economic interdependence against the target states. So here on the slide, we see the case of THAAD deployment to South Korea. I'm sure most of you are aware of it. The picture here of the THAAD launchers running on an airfield is from 2017, but the whole thing emerged in 2016 when United States forces Korea and the South Korean government decided to deploy THAAD to South Korea primarily, or actually only to shield South Korea from North Korean missiles. But China was worried, and also communicated this, that it is worried about the radar's capacity to early detect and intercept also Chinese ICBMs headed for the continental United States. So China used economic coercion especially hard against Lotte. Lotte is a South Korean conglomerate that also provided a golf course for the actual stationing of those interceptors. And China launched especially harsh sanctions against Lotte Mart, which is the retail brand of Lotte, which led to the entire withdrawal from the Chinese market of Lotte Mart. There were furthermore South Korean media products banned from Chinese TV and streaming sites. China used reduction of tourism visas for group travel, which translated into a 48% decrease in Chinese tourists, and is estimated to have cost the South Korean economy $15.6 billion in 2017 alone. And this is really just tourism. There furthermore were public boycotts against Korean car makers Hyundai and Kia, which led to a sales drop for China of 47% in 2017. And since the Chinese portion is such a big, plays such a big part in these Korean car makers, that translated into an 8.7% global sales drop. Another infamous case of economic coercion was certainly against the Philippines, and there we have, this is against the backdrop of the wider South China Sea, which China almost entirely claims, and of course this leads to a number of territorial disputes with regional states, virtually every state that has a coastal line in the South China Sea. And the Philippines are really just one example here. In the particular case of Philippines, and in 2012 or 2011 to 2012, the issue was the territorial dispute over the Scarborough Shoal. And China responded again with tourist restrictions and with restrictions on Philippine agricultural products. And of course, the Philippines later put this in front of the ICJ, and it dragged on until 2016, but this is that's beside the point here. What we see, however, is that China uses its economic muscle to address a security issue. And I want to emphasize this once more, because it may be self-evident or just well known to people from the security studies community. But over the past weeks, I spoke people more from the economic and trade side of the discussion. And it was always important, and I felt, because that was not always clear, that what we have here is that there's not an economic issue in and of itself, which may perhaps be the case in the United States-China trade war, where the substance of the dispute is trade itself, or the economic relation itself. But what we have here in the Asian context and Chinese coercion against these secondary states in the region is that you have a security issue, and then China creates an economic issue where there was none before. So the solution to the problem cannot be the economic issue. And of course, the target state is actually demanded by China to solve the security issue, and then the economic issue will go away, so to say. Here I have an overview of, and really just a selection of cases of economic coercion in the Asia-Pacific context. I already mentioned the Philippines and South Korea, of course. What we have very often as issue is, of course, a territorial dispute. That was also the case with Japan in 2011. Japan is also very interesting because for Japan, China used export restrictions instead of import restrictions. And China can do that when it has dominance of the supply chain, which it has over rare minerals. Besides territorial disputes, there can also be an issue such as the election of a pro-independence president in Taiwan, which again led to restriction of tourist visas, or the reception of the Dalai Lama for the case of Mongolia, which also led to import restrictions and additional tariffs and trade barriers. And at the bottom, I have Australia, which is, the list is much longer than what I mentioned here, both with the issue and the scope of coercion. Here I have the Australia's legislative measures against Chinese influence operation and China's restriction of Chinese students to Australia. But as I'm sure most of you are aware, just last week, there was another Chinese coercion against, economic coercion against Australia, with restrictions on wine imports against the Australian wine industry. So this is really a moving target, and also shows that this is a very current issue. So this is the last slide that I have for the Asia regional context. And what I want to show with this map here, we see on the right side, again, the range of the THAAD radars, on the left side, a map of the Western Pacific. Because I mentioned these two cases before. So what I want to emphasize is that in the Asia Pacific context, there's always a core national security issue in the perspective of Beijing at hand. So we have covered already the Korean case where the THAAD radars might be able to detect Chinese ICBMs heading for the continent of the United States. And so this one was very transparent and clear, I think, and then China communicated its worries. In the South China Sea, I think the issue is a bit less obvious. What we hear very often in the news coverage is that it's about natural resources, including oil, gas, and fish, or about the control of trading routes. What we have on this map here is a depiction of the first and second island chain, which China perceives as a strategy by the United States and its regional allies to contain China's power projection into the Western Pacific, and so to say contain China on the Asian mainland. And since China is not yet able to really break out of this first island chain, it needs the South China Sea as the only water body where it has direct access to deep waters for its submarine fleet to really submerge and evade US and allied sensors. And of course, the submarine fleet is again important for the Chinese nuclear deterrent. So what we really see here in these both cases, you can actually connect it to the Chinese nuclear deterrent, which the Chinese believe is at stake. It doesn't always have to be the nuclear deterrent, but the nuclear deterrent is, I think, very good to emphasize what is at stake from China's perspective. And with that, we are already transitioning to the European theater. After this overview of coercion in Asia Pacific, I will present some cases and observations of coercion against Europe. Here we see a screenshot of a New York Times article, and I'm sure most of you remember this case earlier this year where China threatened to reduce German car sales to China when there were discussions in the German Bundestag on restricting third-party access to European 5G development. And if we remember just a few minutes back, we already learned that China is very much able to restrict an entire country's car industry, like it was the case for Hyundai and Kia in 2017. So this really should be taken serious, these threats by China, because it really may not just be threats. Here's a brief overview then of or a selection of cases of Chinese coercion against European states. I think the Norwegian case is very famous, where China used also import restrictions. What we don't have in the European context are territorial disputes, naturally. But these cases, or the challenge to China's interest there, is a little bit more abstract, but I think it's still obvious what they are. Sweden is a constant case of Chinese coercion. Among them is, of course, the case of Gui Minhai. Dalai Lama also appears very often in the European context. For example, just in 2018, when Daimler quoted the Dalai Lama in an Instagram ad. Similar was for Versace when it listed Hong Kong separately of China in its website. The Premier League was quite often the target of Chinese coercion, once when Mesut Özil expressed support for the Uyghur minority, and once when London expressed support for Hong Kong's democracy movement, or with its decision on Huawei. What we see, however, here is that Chinese coercion somewhere corresponds to the gravity of the challenge to China. That is noteworthy, as it hints that China's coercion is, at least to a degree, measured and calculated, and not a heated emotional lashing out against everyone and anything that doesn't please the Chinese people, as the spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Ministry then would say it. I mentioned before that we can connect Chinese coercion to a threat to China's national security, but then of course we might ask, how do European political actions threaten China's national security? And if we take the Huawei case as one example, the question then still is, why does Huawei in Europe matter for Chinese security? And I think there are two dimensions which are not mutually exclusive. The first is a real prime national security interest for China, if it were the case, and that is that China really wants to collect intelligence through including its own hardware into the European 5G infrastructure. And the second dimension would be that China needs to integrate a national brand, a household name, so to say, into global supply chains and an emerging technology that will be very relevant in the future. So to say that for China's economic interest, it needs its own Siemens, its own Google, its own Facebook. And we see this also in the whole Belt and Road Initiative, the necessity for China to internationalize its industrial base. And I'm quite confident that the second dimension is the case, and whether the first dimension is the case, I wasn't read in on the reports that the European intelligence communities came up with there. So that may or may not be the case. So I'm building up to my conclusion now, and one of the main points that I want to make is that Europe and the United States both have as much, if not more, leverage over China than vice versa. Here on the slide, we see first that the European Union has a trade balance with China, and the EU is furthermore China's second largest trading partner with 14.6% after the United States. China furthermore relies on imports in key technologies. Among them are specialized machinery, advanced semiconductor and manufacturing equipment. And in reality, individual European countries are much less dependent on China than many statistics suggest, because 67% of EU members' trade is intra-European trade, which most trade statistics that show this is the European Union's trade with the rest of the world don't show intra-European trade. To give an example, Germany's exports to China account for only 7.1%, whereas Germany's exports to the rest of the European Union are 59%. All right, here we have a slide of where Germany produces cars. And this really goes back to what was discussed earlier. And the point here I want to make is that European dependency on China is not structural, but rather confined to individual industries and corporations. And that is certainly the case for the German car industry, which are indeed invested in China and earn much of their revenue on the Chinese market. But German car makers also produce most of the cars for the Chinese market in China. And we see on this graph where German automakers produced their cars in 2019, and we see that they in fact produced more cars in China than in Germany. And that is of course fine to do for them, but it really shows that the threat perhaps of China to reduce German car sales, it may be meant serious or not, but we need to understand that this would hit the Chinese part of the operation much more than the German part of the car producing operation. So this just goes to show, I'm not saying that this part of the operation is not important, and this is very important for the balance sheet of BMW and Volkswagen and Daimler, of course. But it's just going to show that there's leverage on both sides of the operation, of course, and we should factor that in when we are confronted with Chinese threats. There are, however, some critical industries in Europe and the United States where China dominates supply chains. I'm sorry, this would still be on the further slide, so don't read the slide just yet. Just 2 more points. In 2019, 60% of car battery cells worldwide were sourced from China, and Chinese companies also dominate the global market of raw materials for battery production. These raw materials are graphite, cobalt, nickel, and lithium. And lastly, the COVID-19 pandemic revealed Europe's over-reliance on global supply chains for pharmaceuticals and medical equipment, which is mostly sourced from China. So in these industries and in critical industries and where China has a supply chain dominance, there, of course, the leverage is real. And now we are approaching the last 3 slides. So over the past almost 20 minutes, I have provided an overview of the phenomenon of Chinese coercion and hinted to the fact that Europe's exposition to Chinese leverage is not as unilateral as news coverage may often suggest. So I will begin with briefly laying out where we're at on the United States and European approaches to Chinese coercion so far. And then I will introduce my thoughts on what can be done on a transatlantic level to address Chinese coercion. The EU and the United States are China's most important trading partners, and they account for 25% of China's total trade. The EU and the United States have furthermore both developed investment screening mechanisms. That's the EU framework for screening of foreign direct investment for the EU and CFIUS for the United States. However, short of economic decoupling, there have been no meaningful concepts or policies to mitigate Chinese economic coercive measures on neither side of the Atlantic. In my understanding, decoupling can be useful in areas of critical strategic importance, or where the United States and Europe overly rely on Chinese-dominated supply chains. These are 5G, defense technology, pharmaceuticals, and medical equipment. But in the overall trade relationship, the best response to China's coercion may just be to double down on liberalism and to increase interdependence. So far, Beijing was able to coerce smaller economies across Asia, where it possessed the ability to inflict much more economic pain on the target state than vice versa. But this only works in the absence of a unified approach to China. If the EU and the United States were to work together, adverse effects would be much more grave for China than the other way around. There's right now a growing transatlantic consensus on China. In Europe, there's a realization that China's rise implicates European security and that economics and politics cannot be separated in diplomatic relations with China. In the United States, on top of a bipartisan consensus on China, there is growing appreciation in the United States that transatlantic cooperation on China should be strengthened. The best approach to facilitate this objective is a new US-EU trade deal that goes beyond the ambitions of TTIP to reduce tariffs and trade barriers. So the Airbus-Boeing issue is of course important, should be addressed, and so are chlorinated chicken, but we could go one step further. And I think that the election of Joe Biden as president provides an opportunity for Europe and the United States to restart and redefine their diplomatic, economic, and security relationship. These are 2 examples to show that there's really this there's on both sides, there's this developing consensus on China. On the left side, we have, I just have a screenshot of the EU-China strategic outlook, which famously divides China as a systemic rival. And on the right side, I have a very recent report by the Committee on Foreign Relations, United States Senate, titled The United States and Europe, a Concrete Agenda for Transatlantic Cooperation on China, which I really understand as an invitation by US policymakers to work with Europeans on many of the issues that I just outlined and described over the past 20 minutes. So this is the last slide, and I will and then I will conclude. Based on everything that we mentioned so far, I propose 4 steps on a transatlantic China policy. The first would be to formulate a US-EU trade deal, call it TTIP 2.0 if you want, to include trade enforcement mechanisms and a blocking statute aimed at third parties. A brief explanation, what do I mean by this? Some of you may be aware of the concept of a blocking statute. This is a European tool originating from the 1990s, back then as a mechanism to shield European companies from US sanctions that were geared to keep European companies to maintain their economic relationship with Cuba. And this blocking statute would have obligated these European companies to continue their economic relationship with Cuba, but also would have remedied any economic damage they would have incurred. If we now apply this, and it was actually put out of the box again 2 years ago in 2018 with the United States sanctions against Iran. What would this mean if we apply this on the transatlantic level and directed at third parties? The idea behind that is really, as I think I may have laid out, is that if China is part of the system as it is in the WTO, there are many issues with that. So we leave that out now. The problem is if China is, or any country, any third parties, you don't have much power over what a third party does. But the blocking statute, if you wouldn't have it within this community, to give an example now, if China would threaten or actually follow through with threats against Germany to reduce car sales, this blocking statute would obligate Germany to not follow Chinese demands, but at the same time, it would remedy all economic damages that Germany in this case would incur through these coercion. And if, for example, one day Australia would be included, this would mean that Australia would be barred from giving into China's demands, which I don't think is an issue, but it would not be allowed to do so. But then it would all economic damages would be remedied. The second proposition is to deepen transatlantic cooperation in critical industries implicating national security. These are 5G, ICT, defense technology, artificial intelligence, energy storage, electric mobility, rare minerals, pharmaceuticals, and medical equipment. So on all these issues that either implicate national security or where China has a supply chain dominance, it would be beneficial for Europeans and Americans to increase their cooperation and thereby decrease vulnerability to Chinese coercion. The third point is to have an increased economic cooperation with China and therefore interdependence on all other non-critical issues and where there's no threat of Chinese supply chain domination. And the fourth point would be to expand 1, 2, and 3 to further allies and partners into a coalition of the willing, if you want, beyond the transatlantic context, notably to the Asia-Pacific region. Lastly, I want to just emphasize that this is not meant as a containment strategy against China. This is really, number one would only be the case so it's in China's hand. If China doesn't coerce, number one would never be there. And number two is in a way common sense to protect critical industries. And beyond that, it's really all about increasing cooperation with China, I believe. And with that, I'm done and I'm looking forward to a discussion.
All right, well, that's a tremendous presentation, Maximilian. Thank you very much. And I will look forward to taking questions from our attendees. Once again, a reminder, use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And please formulate a concise question or comment. I'll turn to that in a second, but I wanted to first to say one of the things I really appreciate about your presentation is the way that it complements, as you've pointed out, the growing recognition in the United States and in many parts of Europe that there is a need to cooperate on policy toward China, that those discussions are not always undergirded by deep reflections on the regional dynamics, especially for China and its neighbors. So I think you bring a really important dimension to this discussion. And I want to dwell on that for a moment, because you've listed in the first kind of chart 6 different attempts that China has undertaken to coerce its Asian neighbors. And what I'd be really curious about is what have the results been? Now, there's probably not enough time to go through each of those, but can you say that China has been successful, or rather unsuccessful, in those attempts at coercion in its region? And then perhaps from there we can extrapolate a bit or try to apply some analysis to the European cases as well. And so does China believe it is succeeding in these regional coercion attempts, or are they rather seen as unsuccessful?
Great question, Jeff. Many thanks. I think the answer to your question would depend on what we believe that China's ultimate objective of coercion is. I think from a realist perspective, you would say that it has been mostly unsuccessful. If we look, for example, again at the Korean case, the missile defense system is after all there. So China's security predicament wasn't really addressed. And the same is the case with the South China Sea. Of course, China has been very belligerent and coercive in this region, and this has been going on. So from the realist would observe that Chinese coercion is in fact not effective. But the wider literature, of course, acknowledges, and then there's the other view, is that China really wants to, that the Chinese bullying on coercion is really about building up a reputation. And if we look more closely, not into these things that relate to territorial disputes, but it's really the case that China has been building up some leverage within ASEAN, where it can, of course, with a divide and conquer strategy, really influence politics. And then, of course, we go beyond just economic, just the sticks, and then also carrots come into play, which I didn't mention so far. Although it's in the title, of course, but in a play of both threatening really regional states, and then the answer giving inducements, carrots to other states, China has been demonstratedly able to influence ASEAN policy making. So I hope this gives you at least an overview of what the state of the discussion is, and it really depends on how you look at it.
Okay, thank you. We've got a number of really interesting questions coming in, so I want to turn to those, and I'll try to hold them together in some kind of rational pattern. So perhaps maybe to look at some of the Chinese instruments, I want to take a question from Jonas Tudnidgar, and his question is, by what mechanism can China threaten to sanction individual EU member states with trade? Aren't EU goods and services non-discriminable? And wouldn't that have automatic repercussions? So what is the Chinese tool that they can use to carry out, for example, the threat against the German auto industry that you described in your presentation?
Right, very good question. So I think I think this is really, and this question really goes to that we understand this. So that very great. So I think if I just go to historic context, if we see how China did this with for example, with the car industry in Korea, this is really a hybrid version, which is China doesn't, in the case of the Korean car cases, China did not say we are not buying these cars anymore, but there were instigation of public boycotts online, which led to Chinese people simply out of nationalism not buying these cars anymore. And this was really, as I demonstrated, not just a few percent, this was a 47% decrease. So this is really meaningful. The same is the case for example, for Lotte. where China, we have to assume, fabricated sanitation issues and other legal aspects. And this is actually very important. Also, if you ask China, China never, if you ask it in if you ask the spokesperson in a press conference, China never exceeds to be coercing unless it is participating in a United Nations sanctions against North Korea, which it did, of course. But if you ask China, they say there is no coercion. What are you talking about? But the feelings or the feelings of the Chinese people are heard, and certainly this has an impact on the economic relations. So they are very hybrid and gray zone-ish about this coercion, and they always deny it. But it's very important for coercion to work to also communicate to the target state, of course, that coercion is happening. Otherwise, the target wouldn't be knowing what's going on. I hope this gave this is very superficial, but I think I addressed it.
Okay, thank you. We also have some questions about particular sectors and about the dependency on Chinese supply chains. So I'll take one kind of illustrative question. This is from Mara Lee. Is China not dominant in laptop or cell phone supply chains and manufacturing? And would you then recommend more integration or interdependence there? And then also including semiconductor production in China. So altogether, is Made in China 2025, this plan for dominance in certain sectors, something the EU and the United States should be trying to stop? Is that your recommendation?
Okay, great question. I will give my views on this. I think for these rare minerals and supply chains that go into a mobile phone and laptop production, I mean, this is not about buying Chinese products in the end, right? If you can buy you should buy a Chinese end product if you think it's the better product. But within the production, so when we would be talking about a European or United States mobile phone production, to the extent that even exists, but also other, of course, high-tech, where you need raw materials. There, I really would advocate, based on my research, that you in fact decouple from China on these everywhere where China has this capacity to coerce and to exploit vulnerability, and this would certainly go into these directions, into this dimension. But again, for Chinese end products, if the Chinese mobile phone in the end, or the Chinese computer, if you think it's a good deal and a good price for the end consumer, that I would not include. And on China 2025, I don't think we should try or can stop it. I think, as I said, I don't believe we should contain China, and also I think we can't. This is also the reality, and this also goes to RCEP recently. I think you really need to look at what you can do and what you are able to do, and also acknowledge that economic cooperation per se is never bad. This is also really one of my main points here.
Okay, thank you. I'll take one more question that relates to the dynamics in Asia, before we start looking in a little more detail at the transatlantic dimension, or at the individual, or at the EU's own instruments. So this is a question from Heinrich Kraft. Should we not enlarge the transatlantic agenda on China by bringing in Japan from the beginning? The US-Japan alliance, he points out, is stronger than ever, and Europe should rediscover Japan as a major partner on these issues. How do you see that?
I fully agree. If this is really due to the perhaps my own location and also the scope of this fellowship, that I looked at it first from a transatlantic perspective, but I think this is perhaps a little bit also natural for Europeans to first look over the Atlantic on such an issue. But we see this also in Germany's, for example, in Germany's Indo-Pacific strategy, that countries like Japan and Australia are increasingly becoming important. So I fully agree, and we shouldn't wait to exclude or to include countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia into this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we'll turn and we'll look at some of the European and transatlantic questions that we've got here. So first, I'd like to take a question from Tim Stuchtai. Would you find it realistic that that if Europe became dependent on 5G networks built with Chinese technology, that would provide additional leverage for even more coercion? In other words, does this have a sort of an exponential effect to it?
That's a very good question because it already paints further the scenario in case that we would in Europe actually go ahead with 5G, which is not yet discussed. But I think this is a very good prediction and question. So the first instinct would, of course, be to say, no, we shouldn't expect China to do this because it would jeopardize itself. But then we remember, of course, all these cases of coercion and say, yes, this is potentially a reality because we really see from the historic evidence so far that there's one thing that matters to China more than its economic relations, and that is really more leverage or security relations. So I think this is a real possibility, but I can't, of course, look into the future.
Okay. So we've got a couple of questions that relate to the blocking statute and similar proposals that you made. So I'll take one as an example. This is from Tobias Gerke. You suggest a new blocking statute, but often the targets of economic sanctions are companies and not states. So even if the states don't want to comply, companies often do, and Europe has shown in the Iran situation that it cannot induce companies to act against their business interests. I would add, personally, you can probably throw the Nord Stream 2 sanctions into this category as well. So how would a new transatlantic blocking statute work to remedy this? And there's a similar question, which is, there would potentially be large amounts of money involved if we were talking about compensating firms that were disadvantaged by some attempt at Chinese coercion. So is that realistic in your view?
Yeah, great questions. On the whether the blocking statute would work, well, so far it hasn't really been used very often, and this is really how this will pan out, or especially on the legal level, I couldn't say because I'm not an expert on this, but from all the instruments that I looked at, this is the only instrument that really is able to do something about a third party that you have otherwise no power about. You could hope that in combination with decoupling in these strategically relevant dimensions, you don't need it actually very often, so it would have only, ideally, it would be barely used and only have a deterrent effect. But then it's really all about the strength of the mechanism on the domestic level. So as the domestic companies were mentioned, it's really about the strength of the legal measures that the individual states have on that company to bind then these companies to oblige to the mechanism and not to obey China's demands. And on the compensation, whether this would not be too costly, again, ideally, the mere existence of this blocking statute would deter China or any other third party from trying to coerce such a big block of states. And apart from that, it works like an insurance company. So the more insured entities you have, because the costs are shared, it would be the remedies would be much lesser for each actor on their own. So, and the more convincing this is, also the less often this, because it has deterrence and it wouldn't actually have to be used that often.
Mm-hmm. Okay. A question also from one viewer pointing out that China is not the only country to apply economic policy tools to foreign policy questions. European states and certainly the United States apply economic sanctions in various cases. So how would you differentiate Chinese economic coercion from sanctions that the United States or European Union applies?
That's a very good question. And I hinted at this before, that China doesn't doesn't say it is actually coercing. So China has also been, I think this is noteworthy, been participating in United Nations sanctions against North Korea. But apart from that is how the Western world, how we sanction is that it's very open and transparent. So usually you have a United Nations resolutions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it says what's the issue. It declares the target state and makes very clear what the target state has to do, and everyone can read it, look at it, and knows what's going on. In the Chinese case, as I described already, this is not so clear and obvious to the target state in the beginning, and China even denies to be coercing. So it says we are not coercing, but our own people are just unhappy, or they will just simply deny that there is any that they instigated these sanitation regulations, for example. But it is still important here to mention that and I also like this question there, that the United States also sanctioned, because really the coercion literature really derives from American scholars from the 1950s and 60s, who devised it as a policy tool for the United States during the Cold War to really resolve international crisis with measures short of war. And this is really where we have to understand coercion. It is less than diplomacy, more than diplomacy, but less than military strength, or using military strength in a violent way. And this is also how, of course, in the broader sense, China uses it, knowingly and consciously not escalating a conflict in a violent way, but using more power than just diplomatic messaging. And then one last point that I want to make here is, of course, because this addresses this question, is the problem that then China has, and we can argue about whether that's not one of the reasons why Chinese coercion has been only semi-successful so far, is really that the coercion literature is very clear that coercion, for one thing, for coercion to work, it must communicate very clearly to the target state what's at stake. Otherwise, the target state will not know what it has to do. And the other thing is to make sure that the exit strategy for the target state is less costly than the actual coercion. And the problem for that, of course, is if you deny that you're coercing in the first place, then the communication is not that clear. So this is also the a possibility why Chinese coercion has been successful, because the target state were not 100% clear what the actual issue is that has to be resolved there.
Okay, thanks. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to take 3 baskets of questions that I think will help us address most of the issues that have been raised, although I apologize if I have not been able to get to every single question. But the first is about the transatlantic dynamic, because you've suggested a sort of a TTIP 2.0. One viewer, John Denny, points out that as you're aware, I'm sure there have been strong objections on both sides of the Atlantic, but especially on the European side, to TTIP in the past. So how do you see, what ways do you see to circumvent these political problems that were demonstrated quite clearly in the last couple of years of the Obama administration with achieving a transatlantic trade deal? But if I could add 2 or 3 aspects to that, it's pointed out also by Jonas Triebgar that the United States, American and European firms are competitors in foreign markets, including in China. And wouldn't that make it more difficult for the United States and Europe to reach an agreement on how they approach Chinese economic coercion, when there's always the danger that one side might seek to secure its own more narrow economic advantage by advancing its own firms? And of course, this opens up lots of opportunities for sort of divide and rule tactics by the Chinese, which I think we already see in some cases. There's also a question about industrial policy. Doesn't this idea of a transatlantic approach in these issues really presuppose an industrial policy that is coordinated across the Atlantic? Is that necessary in your view? It would certainly be a dramatic expansion of the policy objectives. So how do you see these transatlantic issues fitting
Yeah, very well, and thank you for these great questions. And I'm really, this is not my expertise, as you mentioned in the introduction. I'm doing China in the Asia-Pacific region, so I will just give my opinions on that. But this is really, I'm actually more happy to hear than to get also feedback. But I'm sure you have better views on this. So how to circumvent the problems that already exist in TTIP during the Obama administration? That's it's a good point, and this is really. This is really what the next Biden administration and Europeans have come together. And I think all these issues that were there over the 4 years ago, they are not going to go away. And then if Biden goes into the White House, there will be huge piles of issues he will have to address on the international scale. And TTIP will just be one of them, or TTIP 2.0. I don't think there's a way to circumvent these problems. The only way is to address these problems. The problems are the same and even more than 4 years ago. But perhaps there's perhaps the hope that with this new consensus on China that is formed in Europe and in the United States, there's now a bigger objective that might be make European. I think it's the consensus is already there in the United States, but on the European side, that there's more and more the willingness to incur short-term sacrifices for the midterm objectives. But this is really, this is more of a very superficial observation that I have here. And whether they are not EU competitors, or whether there's some competition between American and EU stakeholders, and whether that doesn't make such a trade deal difficult, yes, of course. And this is really where the nitty-gritty of the negotiations will get into, which I'm sure we can have another webinar on another day about this. Good. But I think it goes beyond today's scope, perhaps.
Okay, so let me turn to a point made by Maximilian Ernst, who highlights the theory on interest group representation and the prediction that a small group or an industry that is well organized and that has narrowly defined interests can play an outsized role on democratic decision making. And so, you mentioned the automobile, the Hyundai, Kia example with regard to South Korea. Is it not true then that for a politically influential industry that has a sort of high profile, that coercion can work by targeting them, especially if they're able to influence national decision making?
I mean, this question really goes at the crux of how do you implement and devise such a statute if it really were to be passed into law. But yes, hypothetically, it's possible. If this company, what you first need, of course, and that is, of course, where the blocking statute has fallen short so far, is that these most European companies were actually not taking the risk of following this blocking statute and were, in fact, following US sanctions and discontinued their commercial relations with Iran. So what you actually also need is from the stakeholders in Europe and in the United States to also understand the necessity to shield themselves and Europe and the United States from Chinese coercion. So if this political will and this understanding on sides of the stakeholders is not there, then it will not work. The blocking statute and the remedies would really be to, I think it would cover a lot of cases, but of course, if the coercion will probably still in many cases work. So this is we will have to see, because so far there's very little empirical evidence on how blocking statutes actually work.
Okay, and our last question, I'm going to take one that brings us back to the Asia Pacific or the Indo Pacific, to use the descriptor of the United States and now Germany, and this is from Hans Binnendijk, and he points out that you focused on US and European cooperation on economic and diplomatic coercion. And he asserts that from an American perspective, military competition with China in Asia is a higher priority. So can and how could Europe help deter Chinese assertive behavior in the security sector, in your view, Maximilian?
Yes, great question. And I think in a real, from a realist perspective, when you really look at military capabilities, Europe is not well equipped to change the balance of power in the Western Pacific, but it can do so in a symbolic way. And I wouldn't call it yet a tripwire, but certainly, and this is, as I'm sure most in the audience are aware of, there are discussions now in European capitals, most importantly Berlin, Paris, and because France has already been doing this, of course, so mostly Germany, to really dispatch naval units, a frigate or two, into the region. This would be an only symbolic message, of course. It wouldn't really do anything about the balance of power there, but China is very attentive to this, and it really would, and this then, you know, goes beyond Germany and other Europeans to simply, I think, I think this would be a message that is, even though it's just symbolic, I think Washington would really understand this, that the support that you could call it moral support or symbolic support that Europeans bring to the Western Pacific, that this is really, you know, it would be a very important sign that you really share the burden there. So this is my my projection on this.
Okay, well, that brings us to the top of the hour and to a really lively 60-minute discussion. So Maximilian, I want to thank you for your work as a visiting fellow in the DAAD AICGS fellowship program. I want to thank all of our viewers, and especially those who posed questions today that led to such a rich discussion on a topic that I think is going to be one of the defining issues for the United States and Germany, for the transatlantic relationship in the months and in the years to come. How do we deal in a responsible and effective way with the challenges from China, but while differentiating at the same time between our objectives and avoiding unnecessary confrontation. So thank you so much, Maximilian. Thanks to everyone else out there. And we will look forward to seeing all of you at future seminars with our visiting fellows. We have one later this week and also one next week. So you will see the announcements for those if you haven't already. And we will look forward to the next encounter. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.